Welcome back, everyone. Ms. Cott, are you ready for us to go back on the record?
No, I am back. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I will reorient us. It is the afternoon just after lunch on October 2nd, 2024. I'm Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer for the Administrative Hearings Office, and this is the afternoon portion of our day of hearing on the proposed site's reservoir project. Before we broke for lunch, we had just completed some of the cross-examination of Mr. Stork, and I believe Ms. Mendel Rice indicated that she had questions for Mr. Stork. So with that, I will look to the team and ask if you would please find and pin Mr. Stork and Ms. Mendel Rice, and I believe Ms. Chester, and we can pick up where we left off.
I think you meant Mr. Mooney, not Miss Chester.
I meant Mr. Mooney, yes. Sorry.
It's not often I'm confused with Miss Chester.
Thank you. Mr. Stork, my name is Jenna Mandel Rice, and I represent the state water contractors.
Good to meet you.
DWR is the operator of the state water project. Is that correct?
Yes.
And isn't it true that the Department of Water Resources is the holder of the water rights for the state water project?
Yes.
Department of Water Resources is not a part of the site's project authority. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
And do you also understand that the Department of Water
does.
Resources?
It does, however, operate the facilities to make deliveries to sites customers. So in that sense, it's involved.
But Department of Water Resources is not a participant in sites. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. Unless they choose to buy into it.
In paragraph 52 of your testimony, which for the record, I believe is Friends of the River 10A, your testimony states that the project is presently conceived to be an independent project. It would neither be part of the CVP nor the SWP. Is that a correct reading of paragraph 52 of your testimony?
That is correct, subject to the fact that the project will be using facilities of the State Water Project and the Central Valley Project, potentially.
In paragraph 63 of your written testimony, do I understand that you are suggesting that the board should alter the Department of Water Resources water rights?
I do, and that's because of the delicate question of what we've just been talking about, that the department is, its area of origin responsibilities are involved with State Water Project operations. So sites project water deliveries will in some ways become the area of origin responsibilities that the State Water Project DWR would have. And I am suggesting that the board may wish to have to essentially sort out the potential area of origin responsibilities of the State Water Project versus what the board may assign to the sites authority.
You are aware that none of the Department of Water Resources water rights are the subject of this proceeding, correct?
Not directly, no, that's correct.
Ms. Chester asked you several questions on cross-examination, and in response to some of those questions, I believe that you indicated that sites operations may interfere with State Water Project obligations to make releases for Delta environmental purposes. Did I understand your testimony in response to Ms. Chester's questions correctly?
May is correct.
Are you aware that sites, the Department of Water Resources, and the state water contractors have entered into a settlement agreement?
I am. I've even reviewed it.
And so you are aware of the permit term that is proposed in that settlement agreement as the replacement to an existing or proposed permit term that sites had originally proposed.
Yes, I've seen that.
And isn't it true that under that permit term, sites diversions would be prohibited if they would adversely affect the operations of the Central Valley Project or the State Water Project?
That is the text of the term. Of course, adversely affect can be in the eye of the beholder, and project beneficiaries of the project may not have the same exact perspective on how operations should be for other benefits.
Do you understand that adversely affect is defined within that permit term?
Yes, I've seen that.
Okay. And do you understand that that definition provides that an adverse effect would include any time that such diversion would directly or indirectly require the Central Valley Project or the State Water Project to release water from storage or to reduce their diversion or rediversion of water from the delta to provide or assure flow in the delta required to meet any applicable provision of state or federal law?
I've seen that.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mendel Reyes. I believe, trying to think about my list here. I believe with that, I can turn, I don't have any questions for Mr. Stork. So with that, I'll turn to you, Mr. Mooney. Do you have redirect for Mr. Stork based on those questions?
No redirect. No redirect.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Stork. That was brief. I think if I had known it was brief, we could have released you before lunch, but I appreciate you coming back and joining us. Thank you. You're excused. And I will look to you, Mr. Schutz. I believe you are our next witness. Is that correct, Mr. Mooney? I have that
That
right.
is correct.
And he's here. Mr. Schutz, if you would please raise your right hand and I will administer the oath. Mr. Schutz, do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Mr. Schutz, could you please state your name for the record?
Christopher Robert Schutz.
And do you understand that you're under oath?
I do.
And is Exhibit CSPA-1 an accurate statement of your written statement?
Of my written testimony,
Of your written testimony, I'm sorry.
Yes,
And did you prepare that testimony?
I did.
Okay. And is Exhibit CSPA-2 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
It is.
And are exhibits CSPA-1 to exhibit CSPA-15 true and correct copies of the exhibits to your testimony and relied upon in your testimony?
They, CSPA 3 to CSPA
3.
15, they are.
Yes. And is Exhibit 16 an accurate summary of your testimony?
Exhibit CSPA.
Of your summary of your accurate statement.
I'm sorry, one more time, please. Can we start that again?
I'm going to is Exhibit 16 an accurate summary of your testimony?
CSPA 16 is an accurate summary of
Yes.
my testimony.
And did you prepare that summary?
I did.
And do you have any corrections to your testimony or your statement of qualifications?
I do have a couple of corrections. On page 8 of my written testimony, lines 10 and 12, the exhibit number of the document entitled MBK Tech Memo on Sites and VAs is incorrect. It is not AHO-268. The correct exhibit number is AHO-048.
And
On page, and also on the first page of CSPA 2, my statement of qualifications, the dates for my tenure as Executive Director of the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance, and my tenure as a member of the Steering Committee of the California Hydropower Reform Coalition are transposed. I have been Executive Director of CSPA since 2023. I have been a member of the Steering Committee of the California Hydropower Reform Coalition since 2006.
Okay, and we can't submit a written errata if the hearing officer would
That would-
like that.
That would be helpful. Thank you. I know it's
Okay.
really short, but that would be helpful. Thanks.
Okay. And Mr. Schutz, could you please summarize your testimony?
Yes. Good morning, Hearing Officer Kinsey, board members, AHO, and board staff. I'm Chris Schutz, Executive Director of the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. I've been working on California water issues for 25 years. Ms. Mullen, can we pull up CSPA 16, please? What particularly interested me in my first hydropower relicensing starting in 1999 was the use of a water balance model or operations model to quantify opportunities to understand and potentially improve the management of hydrological systems. I was not trained in a university to work with such models, but I have spent 24 years since then working with operations models and understanding their uses and abuses. This work has included participation in technical working groups to develop hydrology data sets. It has also included successful requests to modify operations models to improve exploration of different management scenarios. Could we have slide 2, please? And I'll wait until Ms. Mullen can sort out the are you able to make that full screen, Ms. Mullen? Down at the bottom there, that's the one on the right. That one. Well, it doesn't look like she's able to. I'm just going to proceed anyway. The purpose of my testimony is shown on slide 2. That is to show selected effects of diversion to sites reservoirs on the Sacramento River hydrograph. There you are. To show net reductions by sites diversions of voluntary agreement flow additions. To show why exchanges between sites and Shasta reservoirs cannot be relied upon to improve conditions for anadromous fish and in the Sacramento River, and to offer limited recommendations. Slide 3, please. And we've been over this, and as well as the erratum in my statement of qualifications, and it's just reiterated here. Slide 4, please. Slide 4 describes how I will generally describe slides 5 through 12. All of the hydrographs I show were generated using Exhibit AHO 49, a tool developed by MBK engineers. They are all daily hydrographs for the Sacramento River at Wilkins Slough, approximately river mile 120, which is a compliance point for the site's diversions. They show examples from the time period 2000 to 2021 at specified times of year. There are a selection of hydrographs which I displayed in Exhibit CSPA 5 in support of my written testimony. All references to water year types refer to the Sacramento River Index as given in Revised Water Rights Decision 1641, which I generally refer to as D1641. For slides 5 through 10, I show a slide and then describe it on the following slide in order that the visual part of the hydrograph is clearly, people are clearly able to see it, and it's large enough to make out the details. So what I'll do today, for example, is show slide 5, and while everyone is looking at slide 5, I will read slide 6. And once everyone has had a chance to look at slide 5 and heard what the description is from slide 6, I'll ask Ms. Mullen to move down to slide 6, and then everyone can visually review what I've just stated orally. And we'll do that for slides 5 and 6, 7 and 8, and 9 and 10. So if we could turn now to slide 4, Ms. Mullen. Slide 5, excuse me. Slide 5 is a below normal example from the water year 2010. The width project hydrograph. And so let's just look at what we're looking at here before we go into the details. The orange line shows the hydrographs for the Sacramento River without sites diversions. The blue line shows hydrographs with potential sites diversions. The black line at the bottom shows the quantity of water that the sites project could potentially divert to storage in sites reservoir under the constraints proposed by the site's authority. So this slide is explained in my testimony on page 6, lines 12 through 15. The width project hydrograph shows long periods where sites diversions would flatline the Sacramento River at 10,700 CFS. It would also reduce flow pulses in February and reduce the volumes of flow pulses and the variability of the hydrograph throughout the period. Could we please turn now, Ms. Mullen, to slide 6 so everyone can review what I just read. And if we turn now to slide 7, please. Slide 7 is explained in CSPA 1, page 6, lines 19 to 23. There were 3 flow pulses at Wilkins Slough in this critically dry year example from 2008, and the time period shown is January 1 through March 16. Sites diversions would have reduced the meager annual peaks, shortened the flow pulses, and created periods where sites diversions would have flatlined the Sacramento River at 10,700 CFS. In some cases, it would have been less. So could we please turn now to slide 8? And I'll reiterate that these were the 3 flow pulses at Wilkins Slough in this particular water year. So we're looking at the pulses that this location saw in the Sacramento River for the year. And if we'd now turn, please, to slide 9. So slide 9 is an April through June example from the below normal water year again, 2010. And it is from April 1 to June 16, June 15 being the last day permitted under the site's proposed diversion criteria. This slide is explained on CSPA 1, page 6, lines 24 through page 7, line 4. Sites diversions would have reduced peak flows in April. You see that on the left. Would have eliminated an early flow recession in May, an early May flow recession, sort of getting toward the middle. And it would have reduced June flows, eliminating a flow pulse. So could we please turn to slide 10? And if we'd now turn to slide 11, please, Ms. Mullen. Slide 11 shows a dry water year example, the month of April in 2012. What one sees here is that sites diversions flatline the Sacramento River hydrograph throughout almost all of the month of April. Could we please turn to slide 12? Slide 12 shows a wet water year example from September in 2011. This is the only year, as I recall, in the 2000 to 2021 period of record addressed by AHO 49 that in which September diversions would have been allowed. But we see that when they would have been allowed, the flow reduction in the Sacramento River at Wilkins Slough would have been about 45% throughout the month. Could we now please turn to slide 13? Now I'd like to turn to the part of my testimony that addresses how diversions to Sites Reservoir would offset annual purported flow additions under the proposed voluntary agreements, or VAs. As noted in my written testimony, this goes specifically to hearing issue 3A1V3, which reads, should any permit issued pursuant to application 25517X01 include conditions to protect proposed voluntary agreement flows or the flows to which proposed voluntary agreement flows are intended to be additive in the event that the Bay Delta Plan is updated to include voluntary agreements. Slide 13 shows tables 3 and 4 from AHO 48, the MBK tech memo on sites and VAs. Table 3, the table on the top of the slide, shows average monthly change by water year type in delta outflow between existing conditions and flows purportedly added under the VA. And I would note it does not include San Joaquin River flows because in my opinion, they're not as relevant to the issues presented by diversions on the Sacramento River. I have highlighted the column on the right in table 3, which shows the average amount the VAs purport to add annually by water year type, and those are stated in thousands of acre feet. Table 4 below shows the average monthly change by water year type in delta outflow between existing conditions and flows purportedly added with the VAs with sites diversions. Table 3 shows a net average annual addition of 600,000 acre feet under the VAs in above normal water years. But when you factor in the sites diversions in above normal water years, as shown in table 4, the net gain of 600,000 acre feet becomes a net loss of 84,000 acre feet. In other words, average annual diversions to sites would take away more flow than the VAs purport to add in above normal years. In below normal water years, diversions to sites would reduce a purported average annual net gain of 521,000 acre feet under the VAs to an average annual net gain of 178,000 acre feet, a reduction of 65% of the purported VA flow addition. And you can see those numbers in the column on the right in table 3. It's in the middle, 521. And in table 4, it's also in the middle at 178. Those are the differences between the two low scenarios compared. Could we please turn to the next slide? Changing gears again. This is a summary of the reasons the Water Board cannot rely on benefits to anadromous fish from potential exchanges between Sites Reservoir and Shasta Reservoir. Most obvious is the fact that the exchanges depend upon an unconcluded agreement between the Sites Authority and Reclamation. Second, there is no clear enforcement mechanism for any purported benefits. Finally, there is no support for the assumption that, quote, flexibility, unquote, for reclamation would provide actual benefits to fish. Ms. Mullen, please turn to slide 15. This is a little busy, but I'm going to explain it. Equally compelling is the mistake in the problem that the site's proponents set themselves up to solve. The idea appears to be that in dry and critically dry years, reclamation would hold additional water in Shasta so that depleted storage would become less depleted. But the problem of running out of water in Shasta Reservoir has to be addressed before storage is so depleted that there is no water left to manage. Looking at slide 15, we have 3 different sets of hydrographs, one from 2006 to 2008 and counting, one from 2011 to 2015, and one from 2019 to 2021. The key years in these figures are 2007, 2013, and 2020. These were the years in which, these were dry years in which settlement contractors got their full allotments. And when the next year was really bad, there was no water left in storage. And you can see these at the bottom of the, as you go down on each figure, you see how the hydrographs bottom out, and when there's a dry or critically dry year that follows, the storage is not able to recover, and we're left in a situation of triage. Adding 300,000 acre-feet of storage or less can't overcome the structural deficit of full dry year deliveries to senior contractors. Slide 16, please. My testimony and supporting exhibits show that Reclamation does not believe that deliveries to settlement and exchange contractors are discretionary. Moreover, when storage is conserved or preserved, in triage circumstances, my testimony, quoting the former executive director of the State Water Board, shows that the primary beneficiary of such storage conservation is water supply. Please turn to slide 17. Based solely on the scope of my testimony, I have several recommendations should the Water Board issue a permit for the site's reservoir project, which I don't think it should do. First, the season of diversion should begin December 1 and end April 30. Diversions outside these time periods are particularly harmful to the Sacramento River hydrograph. Second, there should be no diversion to sites in critically dry, and below normal water year types. Third, if the voluntary agreements are adopted, diversions to sites should be limited to wet years only. Those are years in which the voluntary agreements add very little and in which the actual water in the system would overwhelm both sites diversions as a general rule, and any changes in delta outflow that the voluntary agreements might make. Finally, rather than vague promises, voluntary actions, and unenforceable representations regarding exchanges between Sites Reservoir and Shasta Reservoir, sites diversions should be based on performance measures that turn on how fish in the Sacramento River fare in each year. There should be no diversions to sites in water years following winter run salmon, temperature dependent mortality, when it's greater than 30%, or when egg to fry survival is less than 25%. And there should be no diversions to Sites Reservoir in water years following years when the total October to December stage change in the Sacramento River below Keswick Reservoir is greater than 1.5 feet. Thank you very much for your attention. That concludes the summary of my testimony. And Ms. Mullen, you can show the nice picture at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shute. I think at this point, I get to look to Ms. Chester, I think. Do you have questions for Mr. Schutz?
I do, thank you.
Please go ahead.
Ms. Mullen, can you please bring up CSPA 1? Thank you. And before I get started, I do want to say, Mr. Schutz, I appreciate you being here for questioning today. Can we please turn to PDF page 3? I'm sorry, can we confirm that I have the wrong page? Can you please scroll to paragraph 7? Oh, great, thank you. In paragraph 7 in line 25, Mr. Schutz, you described the Sites Reservoir project as being without responsibilities such as those required of the CVP and SWP under D 1641. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Are you aware that Sites has requested standard permit term 96?
I am.
Are you aware that term 96 would require sites to comply with any Bay Delta water quality control plan then in effect?
I am.
Can we please go to PDF page 5? And scroll to paragraph 12, please. Now, Mr. Schutz, in lines 15 through 17, you acknowledge that diversions to sites would not limit operations of the SWP and CVP. Is that correct?
It's a general rule. That's true. Yes.
If sites would not limit operations of the SWP and CVP, then it would not limit the CVP and SWP's compliance with D 1641. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can we please go back to PDF page 4 to paragraph 9? Mr. Schutz, you state here that sites would have the largest and most direct effect on the Sacramento River hydrograph when flows at Wilkins Slough are between 10,700 cubic feet per second and 20,000 CFS. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How often are Wilkins Slough flows between 10,700 CFS to 20,000 CFS under without project conditions?
It varies from water year to water year. I believe I chose out representative examples from the 2000 to 2021 period of record that are illustrative of that flow range.
And how did you select the range of 10,700 CFS and 20,000 CFS?
10,700 CFS is the proposed constraint below which, constraint at Wilkins, for a flow at Wilkins Slough below which the Sites Authority would, as proposed, not be allowed to divert water to Sites Reservoir. 20,000 CFS was a somewhat arbitrary, but not entirely arbitrary, top end figure based simply on the proportion of flows in the Sacramento River without project and the percentage that the diversions to sites would account for. And so I wanted to account for two different things. One was the situations in which sites could make full diversions of the full proposed diversion of 4,200 CFS to Sites Reservoir, and that would be above the 14,900 CFS range. And then I wanted to look also at those time periods between 14,900 and 10,700 CFS when sites would be making partial diversions and therefore what I called flatlining the hydrograph at 10,700 CFS.
So in your analysis from 2000 to 2021, you did not determine how often Wilkins Slough flows were between 10,700 to 20,000 CFS under without project conditions.
I didn't do a specific quantitative analysis, but I did review each of the hydrographs for that time period, and I observed that there were a number of times in a good number of years in which those flow ranges were present. And I also understood that if in fact we had, say, a very wet water year like 2023, when the flows were much greater than 20,000 CFS, then the time periods and the situations that I address in my testimony would largely not apply.
I believe you offered an estimate of a good number of years. Can you get any more specific?
Well, one could look at AHO 49 and go through year by year. I didn't do that.
In paragraph 9, you also state that project diversions would reduce without project Wilkins Slough flows between 20,000 CFS and 14,900 CFS by as much as 21 to 28%. Is that correct?
Correct.
How often are Wilkins Slough flows between 14,900 CFS and 20,000 CFS when diversion criteria are also met?
I think that's clearly demonstrated in AHO 49. And so that's something that you could simply go and look at with evidence presented by the AHO and that was developed by MBK.
And your explanation for the selection of 20,000 CFS, is that the same as you previously described?
Yes.
You mean previously described in reference to paragraph 9?
Correct.
Okay.
Can we please go to PDF page 6? In paragraph 13, you state that you use the data in the site's historical water availability analysis tool and VA analysis that's in AHO 49. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can we please scroll to PDF page 8? And in paragraph 21, You referenced the MBK tech memo on sites and VAs, is that correct?
I do.
Can we please bring up AHO 48? Thank you. Mr. Schutz, is this the MBK tech memo on sites and VAs that you intended to reference in your testimony in paragraph 21?
I believe it is.
And did you review this memo in conjunction with your use of the historical water availability analysis tool and VA analysis in AHO 49?
Yeah.
Can we please go to PDF page 3? Do you see the first full paragraph on this page beginning with the historical WAA tool?
I do.
And do you see that it says the WAA tool is not an operations model?
I do.
Isn't it correct that the historical WAA tool does not simulate actual operations of the projects, only maximum possible diversions during a historical period?
That's correct. However, that's correct.
Is there any statement in your written testimony that acknowledges that your hydrologic analysis relies on maximum possible diversions?
I think it says potential diversions.
The last sentence in this paragraph of the technical memorandum begins with, by including the simplifying assumptions itemized below. Do you see that sentence?
I do.
Did you review those listed assumptions?
Yeah.
Did you take those assumptions into consideration in reaching the conclusions in your written testimony?
I did.
How so?
I understood that they were potential diversions, and that they included simplifying assumptions such as not allowing for the fact, not being able to account for limitations in conveyance capacity or storage.
Thank you.
I did think that of the various tools available, this was the one that provided the most reasonable way of looking at daily diversions. First of all, it performs a daily analysis. It's based on historical flows, and it doesn't have to make a lot of simplifying assumptions about how sites or anyone else would actually operate the project, or how sites partners, project partners, would call on water, and that would sort of that in turn would affect how much storage space was available. So there are simplifying assumptions. I assume that the use of historical data on a daily basis with potential operations evaluated and hypothesis or whatever developed by MBK was probably the most reliable single tool to use in order to explain potential effects of the sites project on delta outflow.
So it's correct that you considered using other tools for your hydrological analysis, is that correct?
I did. I downloaded all of the historical hydrographs from 2000 to 2021. I looked at those, and in fact, I based most of my initial analyses using those historical flow patterns at Wilkins Slough downloaded from CDEC. One of the hard things, there are two difficulties in imagining what diversions would actually be. Well, there are at least two. One is that the pulse protections, without having some kind of algorithm available, would be hard to estimate, and MBK estimated those. So that's something that I took into account and thought that the tool, therefore, was probably better than I could do by trying to synthesize it myself.
Did you
And then, excuse me if I could finish, and then other operations in the delta that might limit diversions to sites. I assume that to the degree possible that MBK had considered those, and that it could probably do a better job of that than I could, sort of trying to put it together from scratch.
Did you consider using the CalSim modeling?
I did not use the calcium modeling because it's a monthly model primarily, and the degree of resolution that I was seeking would just completely be lost. And it's my view that when you average over a long time period and you're looking at particular changes in a hydrograph, you miss an enormous amount by having a monthly time step. So the daily time step was perhaps the most important consideration in what I chose, in how I chose to do the analysis.
Can we please go back to CSPA 1, PDF page 6? Can you please scroll to the bottom to the footnote? Mr. Schutz, I believe I heard you say that you had professional experience with hydrological modeling. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In footnote 6, you state that a hydrologist generated the figures that you used in CSPA 5. Is that correct?
That's correct. I found that when I tried to run the sites tool, my version of Excel was too old to produce all of the data. So I got on a Zoom with Mr. Reese and asked him to do what I needed to have done because my version of Excel didn't support it. Subsequently, I went and got a new computer and a new version of Excel and was able to reproduce the data that Mr. Reese produced and verify that it was what it was supposed to be. So it wasn't that I didn't know how to do it. It's that my technology was deficient and I was up against a short time clock.
Can we please go to PDF page 8 to the bottom? In paragraph 23, you discuss alternative 6A and the draft staff report for the update of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, correct?
Correct.
And you have a quote from the staff report that states additional mechanisms are needed to protect the base upon which the VA flows are intended to be additive from diversion. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can we please bring up AHO number 279? Thank you. And can we please go to PDF page 792? Mr. Schutz, the quote that I read from your testimony is on the bottom of PDF page 792 of this document, correct?
I cited it by the actual page number, not the PDF page number. If you could zoom in, I
Yes,
could
I
verify
believe
that.
we're looking at 7.2-15.
Okay.
I apologize for the distraction. Can you please repeat your answer?
If the question was, did the quote come from this source? The answer is yes.
Okay, thank you. Can we please go to PDF page 4792? Oh, excuse me, 4765. Do you recognize this document, Mr. Schutz?
I do, although there are a lot of documents in this section of the staff report, and it might take me a moment to situate this where it is, but go ahead and ask your questions.
Do you know that under the VA proposal, what the baseline is upon which the VA flows are intended to be additive?
Generally, I do.
Can we please go to PDF page 4765? I apologize, we are there, 4769. Mr. Schutz, do you see section 4.1 in this page?
If Ms. Millen could scroll in, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Do you see the discussion in this section regarding the VA flows will be additive to the delta outflows?
I see that discussion.
And does that confirm your understanding that the VA proposal, what the baseline is upon which the VA flows are intended to be additive?
I understand what they're saying, yes.
May we please go back to CSPA 1? PDF page 9. And at the top of the page here, at the end of paragraph 23, you conclude that the State Water Board staff recognized the need for stringent diversion criteria for diversions under new water rights. Is that correct?
Correct.
Does the staff report that we reviewed specifically identify stringent diversion criteria for new water rights as the additional mechanisms necessary?
That's my characterization of it.
Based on what information?
Based on a reading of alternative 6A. My understanding of alternative 6A is that the voluntary agreements are intended to be additive to the baseline conditions that you just showed. The State Water Board staff understood that if there are new diversions that come forward, a flow regime that is based on being additive to an existing set of diversions would be the additive value would be changed and that the net addition would be different, and that therefore there needs to be protection so that the additive flows are truly additive and not just making up for additional water that's taken away.
Does the staff report include the phrase stringent diversion criteria?
No, that's my interpretation of what the board staff is saying in alternative 6A.
So in their discussion of additional mechanisms, there is no mention in the staff report of diversion criteria. Is that correct?
I don't know that I would say that. I'd have to review the entirety of 6A. I think I've accurately and fairly captured the intent of alternative 6A, which is to maintain additions so that the outflow is more than the existing condition.
But it's correct that you don't have a citation to the staff report that identifies diversion criteria. Is that correct?
I think the citation above captures the intent of diversion 6A. Additional mechanisms are needed to protect the base upon which VA flows are intended to be additive from diversion.
Okay. Can we please go to PDF page 10, paragraph 26? And can you please scroll to lines 12 and 13? Mr. Schutz, here you stated that the purported benefits of the sites project are founded on the faulty assumption that preserving storage in Shasta Reservoir provides a benefit to fish rather than a water supply benefit. Is that correct?
Correct.
Isn't it possible for water released from storage to provide both a benefit to fish and a water supply benefit?
It is, but as Mr. Howard pointed out in, I believe it was the CSPA 7. Yes, CSPA 7. The primary beneficiary of preserving storage or conserving storage, as he put it, under triage conditions was water supply.
What do you mean by primary benefit?
Whatever Mr. Howard meant.
So this is not your own opinion, this is reference to opinion of another expert, is that correct?
It's a reference to the executive director of the water board in a state water board document. And it's an opinion with which I agree.
So you don't have an independent understanding of what he means by primary benefit?
I think I do.
Can you please describe that understanding?
Sure. Releases from Shasta Reservoir have multiple functions. And they provide more than one function at any given time.
Can we please, oh, I apologize.
Wait, I mean, he was still working
Okay.
on it.
The entire TUCPs and combined with the Sacramento River Temperature Management Plan, for example, in 2014, was framed as a benefit for fish primarily. And I don't think there was a benefit for fish. The mortality, temperature-dependent mortality of winter run Chinook salmon was greater than 90%. That's documented in CSPA 7. And the construct under which the TUCP and the temperature management plan taken together were created did not consider reducing water supply deliveries to senior water rights contractors. So my opinion is that the primary beneficiaries were the senior water rights contractors. And they did fairly well, not as well as they would have liked in 2014. I believe that their deliveries were on the order of 65 to 75% to the settlement contractors. And the fish mortality was extreme. And I think that's pretty good definition of the fact that the primary beneficiaries were water supply and water supply, entities that receive water supplies, and that any benefit to salmon or other fish was incidental.
Can we please go to PDF page 14? And scroll to paragraph 41.
Mm-hmm.
And in this block quote, Mr. Schutz, isn't it correct that temperature control releases are non-consumptive uses, and as such, the flows released for temperature control are available for diversion or export?
That's true.
Thank you. Can we please go back up to PDF page 12? And to paragraph 33. Mr. Schutz, here you state that sites discussed benefits in terms of what could be instead of what shall be or must be. Is that correct?
Correct.
The site's reservoir is not operating currently, is it?
No, it's not.
And if sites was limited to a certain threshold of minimum benefits to fish when operating, how would that be measured?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Could you say that again, please?
If sites was limited to a certain threshold of minimum benefits to fish when operating, in your opinion, how would that be measured?
Are you meaning to say if diversions to sites reservoirs were limited by the effectiveness of sites operations in benefiting fish? Is that what you're getting at?
I'm getting at the fact that you're asking for firm commitments from sites in its operations to benefits from fish, rather than the, as you call them, hypothetical in this paragraph. So I'm asking, what would those non-hypothetical benefits be, and how would that be measured?
I can answer the how they would be measured part. I'm not sure I can answer what the hypothetical benefits would be. That's what I'm pointing out is lacking at this time from the site's testimony. In terms of the benefits, my suggestion was that regardless of the particular mechanism by which sites were able to affect or improve the operation of Shasta Reservoir, that sites reservoir diversions in any given year be conditioned on the performance of in terms of fish mortality in the Sacramento River in the previous spawning year and season. And there's two sort of parts to that. One is, I don't see how you can have an enforceable condition that would compel reclamation to do something, and I don't think to operate in a different way, and I don't think you've described what that looks like. And second of all, in any case, what I do know about the life cycle of fish, although that's not part of my testimony, is that when you have depressed conditions during one part of the life cycle, it's more important to not increase stressors in other parts of the life cycle. So if you have a bad year for temperature for winter run Chinook salmon, for example, either if there's temperature dependent mortality of eggs or low egg to fry survival, or for fall run Chinook salmon, where you don't have enough water to keep redds wet and you dewater a significant number of redds at the end of the season, then sites diversion should be limited because it would add yet another stressor to the already depressed, in this hypothetical, populations of the cohort of salmon or cohorts of salmon for the previous water year.
So it's not your suggestion that sites at this time assume or estimate impacts to fish and condition its operations accordingly?
It's my suggestion that sites define what the operations would be that would actually would prove benefits to fish, that it defined what the enforceability of those operations would look like. And I think there's a lot of problems in creating those. And so far, I haven't seen any details that suggest that it's possible, let alone achievable.
In paragraph 36 on this page, you state that reclamation prioritizes contractual water supply needs over cold water pool management of Shasta Reservoir. Is that correct?
I said they have historically prioritized, yes.
What's your basis for that conclusion?
Primarily Shasta operations in the years shown on slide 15 of my PowerPoint. 20, to some degree, 2007 to 2009, to a greater degree, 2013 to 2015, and 2020 to 2022.
And how did you reach a conclusion about reclamation's priorities based on that data?
Well, one of the main ways that I went about reaching that conclusion was that in 2021, when things were looking really dire, I and my colleagues from CSPA and other organizations submitted an alternative temperature management plan for the operation of Shasta Reservoir in 2021. That operation was not adopted by the State Water Board, and it was not adopted by Reclamation. There were substantial deliveries of water to Sacramento River settlement contractors in 2021. And my recollection is that there were there are even more substantial deliveries to Sacramento River, to San Joaquin River exchange contractors in 2021. And I believe that's documented in CSPA 8, Water Rights Order 2022-0095. Going back to 2021, we proposed an alternative temperature management plan, given the highly depleted condition of Shasta Reservoir and Trinity Reservoir for that matter. And the board and Reclamation declined to adopt it. In 2022, as my testimony states, Reclamation adopted much of the same recommendations that we had recommended in 2021. Because in my view, they really didn't have any choice. And I describe in my testimony some of the caveats that were placed on that, and the fact that this was all done on a voluntary basis that is not enforceable as a precedent in the future.
Are you aware of the interim operations plan that was requested by Reclamation and ordered by the United States District Court for the Eastern District of California in 2022?
I'm generally aware of it. It's not something that I've dealt with extensively.
Are you aware of the percentage of contractual water supplies Reclamation provided to Sacramento River settlement contractors in 2022 under that interim operations plan?
I am. It was about 18%.
So then you know that the water supplies provided by the settlement contractors in 2022 were less than the 75% supplies that they are entitled to during critical years under their contract with Reclamation, correct?
I'm aware of that, and I addressed that in my testimony.
Can we please go to PDF page 13? And scroll to paragraph 38. Thank you. Mr. Schutz, you state that Reclamation employed the strategy of preserving storage for cold water pool management during periods of drought, but it failed, correct?
Correct.
Hypothetically, could additional cold water pool management by preserving storage lessen impacts to fish in drought years?
I think the emphasis on drought years is misplaced. And the question would be when you are increasing or conserving or preserving storage.
So
I don't see any, excuse me if I could finish. And I don't see anything in the site's proposal, as limited as it is, that would propose to increase storage in Shasta Reservoir and carry it over into a subsequent water year.
Can we please go to PDF page 15? Paragraph 43. Mr. Schutz, you quote the State Water Board's conclusion that preserving storage in Shasta Reservoir in 2021 improved conditions for salmon, but was insufficient to avoid significant temperature-related mortality. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you conclude that added storage from sites is no assurance that Reclamation will optimize added storage for temperature control. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's one thing to do something in a model and not change anything else other than increasing storage in Shasta and substituting storage water from sites. It's another to understand how Reclamation would dynamically respond to the potential for an additional amount of water available in Shasta, or what it would do with it.
May please go to CSPA 8.
Okay.
Mr. Schutz, this is the State Water Board Rights Order 2022-0095 that's cited in paragraph 43 of your testimony. Is that correct?
Correct.
And can we please go to PDF page 19? And can we please scroll to the last paragraph? Do you see the first line of this last paragraph that begins with due in part to unexpected losses in runoff?
I do.
And if you continue reading that sentence, isn't it correct that Reclamation failed to meet its storage target in 2021 due in part to losses in runoff?
That's true. And by losses in runoff, I'm not sure it's losses in runoff exclusively. It's also that anticipated runoff failed to materialize.
In your opinion, couldn't adding a project to capture additional storage avoid some of the temperature impacts to fish that occurred in 2021?
hypothetically, it could if there was an enforceable mechanism to assure benefits, and if there was a clear plan and agreement that was enforceable to carry them out. And if dynamically reclamation and or DWR did not change its overall operations in response to the availability of another pool of water. And my opinion is, based on past practice, some changes would be likely.
You describe those changes in your testimony?
I do not.
Can we please go back to CSPA 1, PDF page 16? In paragraph 45, you state that water was transferred south of the delta instead of conserved in Shasta Reservoir in case 2022 was also a drought year. Is that correct?
Correct.
If more water had been stored upstream of the delta at the start of the drought period, wouldn't there be more water conserved in storage for future drought years?
There would have been. It would have been in Shasta Reservoir, and which is where you'd want it.
Can you please go to PDF page 18? In paragraph 50 at line 4, you state that a reactive policy of triaging drought once storage is depleted is a flawed strategy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in line 8, you say that it's necessary to start to address drought in the first relatively dry water year, in part by managing carryover storage, correct?
Correct.
Wouldn't Sites Reservoir help address drought earlier by increasing storage?
It wouldn't address the other part of the equation in that sentence, which is by reducing deliveries. So my opinion is that what Sites Reservoir is proposing to add does not offset the amount of water that's drained in the first dry year from Shasta and other reservoirs. So if you imagine that Shasta storage is a bathtub, you're basically draining more water than you're putting in.
So I think I heard you answer this question by omission, but to confirm, Sites Reservoir would increase storage, is that correct?
Sites Reservoir would increase overall north of Delta storage. That's true. However, what anyone did with Sites storage is yet to be determined. And there's no agreement or even description of an agreement about how it could benefit fish in the Sacramento River.
Can we please go to page 20, paragraph 55? Mr. Schutz, you state that the facts and analysis in this testimony support the inclusion of permit terms discussed below to partially mitigate some of the greatest effects of diversions to Sites Reservoir on the Sacramento River hydrograph, correct?
That's correct.
Diversions that cause a change in the hydrograph do not necessarily constitute an injury to legal users of water, correct?
That's correct.
Diversions that cause a change in the hydrograph do not necessarily constitute an adverse effect to fish and wildlife, correct?
Not necessarily. And as I stated in my testimony, I do not go into the biological consequences, other than very generally, of what changes in the hydrograph would be. Most of that is covered in the testimony of Dr. Rosenfeld. In addition, this testimony sets up the ability to rebut some of the authorities' testimony, which largely, in my opinion, relies on averages for its analysis of fish. So that by showing that the talking point of Sites Reservoir, that you're only diverting in high flows or excess flows or storm events or whatever, and there are many different examples of that, doesn't capture the effects to fisheries. And this testimony in part sets up rebuttal of some of the fisheries claims that the authority has made.
You don't cite to any of those examples of averages regarding fish in your testimony, do you?
I'm sorry, I kind of lost you there. Can you state the question again?
Yes, you mentioned that there were examples of sites using averages related to fish impacts. You didn't cite to any of those sites exhibits in your testimony, did you?
Not that I recall. I think it's been extensively discussed under cross-examination by various of sites witnesses by various parties.
Diversions that cause a change in the hydrograph do not necessarily constitute an adverse impact to public trust resources, correct?
That's a little more, and even for fish, it's a little. I guess it depends on where you're placing the emphasis in your question. If the question is necessarily, then I think I would agree. I think there is a lot of documentation, some of which you'll hear from Dr. Rosenfield, some of which you'll hear perhaps later in the testimony on rebuttal, in the proceeding on rebuttal, that changes in the hydrograph do have adverse effects on fish and wildlife. Variability certainly is one issue that Anna Sturrock and others have quoted extensively, and I believe Ms. Sturrock's work is quoted and cited and put together as an exhibit in Dr. Rosenfield's testimony.
In paragraph 55, going back to the language, you state that the facts and analysis in this testimony support the inclusion of permit terms discussed below to partially mitigate some of the greatest effects of diversions to Sites Reservoir on the Sacramento River hydrograph. Correct? And what you've identified is facts and analysis contained in others' testimony, correct?
I believe that changes in the hydrograph are worthy of mitigation. And the fact that I don't pull in the biological reasons at this point for that doesn't mean that there aren't biological reasons. It's just not my particular, my best subject, let's say.
So I just want to confirm, your conclusion in your testimony is that the relevant facts and analysis are contained in your written testimony, but it's correct that the facts and analysis may be contained in others' testimony, right?
That's not what he said.
Can
Objection.
you clarify?
What I said was, I believe that changes in the hydrograph warrant conditions to avoid changes in the hydrograph in some cases. And then I've put forward the physical details of what those changes in the hydrographs are. And the specifics of how to address those in terms of the biology are better addressed in the testimony of others. Biologically.
Based on your statement in paragraph 55 regarding the facts and analysis in this testimony, is it correct that the diversions can cause a change in the hydrograph are not necessarily contrary to the public interest?
Again, I think that the emphasis on the answer to the question depends on how you, where the emphasis in your question is. If the answer is necessarily, if the emphasis is solely on the term necessarily, then the answer would be yes. I think many changes do have adverse effects.
And your opinion that many changes have adverse effects, is that supported by facts and analysis in your written testimony?
Yes, I've shown adverse effects to the change to the hydrograph.
Related to the public interest?
I'd say they're related to the public interest and the public trust. Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of being put in a position here where it's like you can't get a job without a history, and you can't get a history without a job. And I don't think Dr. Rosenfield goes into the changes to the hydrograph that that sites specifically would create. Nonetheless, he presents testimony regarding biological impacts and what is needed for fish. And it's sort of like you're asking us to combine those two necessarily, and I think taken together, they provide a compelling story.
Mr. Schutz, do you understand that my questions are being generated from the line in this paragraph that states the facts and analysis in this testimony?
And it says, due to mitigate some of the greatest effects of diversions to sites reservoir on the Sacramento River hydrograph. And that's what I'm talking about.
And isn't it correct that you've indicated that others' testimony influence your opinions on the Sacramento River hydrograph?
This is kind of asked and answered, and it seems like we're kind of going in circles at this point. So just object on those grounds.
I just want to clarify the record.
All right, well, okay, go ahead.
But I'm done with this line of questioning.
Yeah,
we can move on. So can we please go to page 21? Now this is labeled paragraph 53, but there are two paragraph 53s. In this paragraph 53 at lines 4 to 5, you state that the effects of diversions in May and June eliminate important flow pulses, correct?
Correct.
You have not offered any evidence to support your statement that flow pulses are important, is that correct?
Other than to the shape of the hydrograph, that's correct.
And you have not offered any evidence to demonstrate that diversions in May or June that change the hydrograph adversely affect outmigration of fish species, is that correct?
No, that's covered by Dr. Rosenfield.
Can we please scroll to lines 10 to 12? You state here that site's messaging has consistently suggested that diversions would divert high flows, and state it is important to effectuate that principle on a water year basis, not simply as an instantaneous basis, correct?
Correct.
You have not offered any evidence of project impacts that support your suggestion that sites should not divert in critically dry or below normal water years, correct?
I think I specifically offered evidence regarding the voluntary agreements regarding below normal water years. And I gave an example of what I believe it was from 2008, of what sites diversions would do to the hydrograph in that critically dry year. That critically dry year would have basically scalped the only 3 meager flow pulses that took place in the Sacramento River in that year. I provided other examples in dry years, in particular, well, in dry years, of what diversions to sites would do to the shape of the hydrograph. So that was the basis for which I made those recommendations.
Does your hydrological analysis consider the timing of VA flows relative to sites diversions?
Generally.
Can you please clarify by what you mean generally?
I'm aware, and you asked if it considered, I'm aware that the voluntary agreements propose to release most of their purported flow assets in March through May. Some of the and that's the timing of that is all very vague and unclear, and it seems to be, as I understand it, and I have studied this quite a bit, based on sort of real-time evaluations, and probably to some degree convenience to the various entities contributing the VA flows. As far as the interaction with sites diversions, I'm aware that depending on the water year, sites diversions happen more or less in March, April, and May, and that there may be the opportunity for some direct interactions. Most of my testimony did not focus, as did Mr. Walker's, on whether sites was just directly diverting flows purportedly added upstream as VA assets. My analysis addresses the fact that on an annual basis, in above normal years, for example, sites is taking away more water than the VAs are putting in. So that was that was how I looked at the interaction between the VA flows and sites diversions on an annual basis, not an instantaneous basis.
And you relied on the site's historical water availability analysis because of its daily flow in data, correct?
That was one of the reasons, also because I thought the MBK analysis on when diversions would be available would probably be more reliable than anything I could independently come up with.
Did you use that daily data to consider the timing of VA flows relative to sites diversions?
No, because I don't know what the timing of VA flows would be. I mean, there is a rough blocking out of VA flow assets in AHO 48. And there's some analysis as to when the VA assets would be deployed, but it's all very general. And as I recall, AHO 48, one of the assumptions is that they don't know when on a daily basis the VA flows would be added, and they just sort of put it in over the time period, over the month, with the exception that there might be some particular circumstances in which they might back off or something like that. But it's not the VA flow analysis, as I understand it in AHO 48, does not sort of contemplate any particular daily basis. And it would be dependent on the actions of many independent actors and how it all got coordinated, if in fact it did.
You state that you used AHO 48 and 49 in reference to the historical tool. Did you use AHO 45?
I looked at AHO 45 and I started using AHO 45, and there was no clear description between AHO 45 and AHO 49 as it was developed. After discussing it with Mr. Reese and others, well, primarily with Mr. Reese, our decision was to use the most recent tool, on the theory that any refinements that had been made in the diversion analysis would be captured in the more recent tool. And I confirmed, I believe on cross-examination with Mr. Walker, that AHO 45 and AHO that the site's diversions analysis is not any different than AHO 49. There's some additional material added regarding VAs and so forth in AHO 49, but there's not a difference. As a general matter, and I looked for this, when there are different versions of models or tools or calculators or whatever they are, there's a tab at the front that sort of goes through what changes have been made to different tools. And there are no such tabs in either of those.
Do you agree that sites water availability analysis using the historical tool shows opportunities to divert during critically dry, and below normal water years?
I do, and I think it's a bad idea.
Do you agree that the site's water availability analysis historical tool only shows opportunities to divert in critically dry, and below normal water years at times when sites' proposed diversion criteria are met?
Of course.
Can we please scroll to page 21 to 22? Thank you. This is the second paragraph 56. You suggest that the State Water Board should include permit terms concerning exchanges between Sites Reservoir and Shasta Reservoir, correct?
I'm sorry, where are we again? Page 21?
This is page 21 and it carries over to page 22. In this paragraph, you suggest that the State Water Board should include permit terms concerning exchanges between Sites Reservoir and Shasta Reservoir. Is that correct?
Right. Yes.
And you suggest that permit terms based on performance standard related to Chinook salmon mortality and spawning, correct?
Correct.
You have not offered any biological evidence into your testimony to support these proposed terms, is that correct?
Specifically, the percentage level of winter run Chinook salmon egg mortality or egg to fry survival. Is that what you're referring to?
I'm asking about any biological evidence that supports this paragraph.
No, that's in Dr. Rosenfield's testimony. He suggested those numbers.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chester. Well, let's go ahead and take a break, then I'll look to the others to see if we have any additional cross for Mr. Schutz. I think it's an appropriate time. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 3:10. Okay, looks like 3:11. Ms. Cott, are you ready for us to go back on the record?
If I could get help with the name of Anna Strock, something like that. I can't find that one.
Yes. Sturrock.
And is it Anna, A-N-N-A?
ANNA.
Thank you. All right, with that, I'm ready to go.
Great, thank you. With that, I will turn to Mr. Soderlund. Do you have questions for Mr. Schutz?
Yeah, I have a few questions.
Please, go ahead.
Great. Hi, Mr. Schutz.
Hello, Mr. Soderlund. It's been a long time.
It has. Nice to see you. Nice to talk with you too. It's been a long time. I've been kind of quiet this whole hearing, so nice to actually participate. I just have a few questions. Ms. Chester addressed this in some of her questions, so I don't think we have to go very deep, but I just want to clarify my understanding. And if we could bring up Exhibit C, SPA 1, I believe it's page 8 of the PDF. Yeah. Right there on lines 6 and 7, you have a heading that states sites diversions would reduce or zero out purported flow additions from the proposed voluntary agreements. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would it be fair to characterize that heading as a conclusion, with regard to sites' impacts on VA flows?
I think that's a summary of the testimony that comes thereafter.
So based off that, is it your testimony that sites will be diverting actual VA flows or be diverting at a time when VA flows are being released?
That's not my testimony. And I believe I clarified this with Ms. Chester. What my testimony refers to is the annual amounts of water diverted on the one hand by sites and added on the other hand by the VA, purported to be added by the VA flows. And I would add that it's my view, and I've presented to the Water Board on this issue, that the purported VA additions are likely to be somewhat less than that the actual VA conditions are likely to be somewhat less than the purported VA additions. So part of the testimony or the line of questioning that went before had to do with the fact that the AHO 49 may overestimate diversions to sites reservoir. I think it's also important to understand that it may overestimate the additions of water to delta outflow under their sites, under the voluntary agreements.
Thanks. So would it be fair to state that your conclusion would not change if sites did not divert actual VA flows or at a time when VA flows were being released?
I think that to do that would make the entire voluntary agreement framework a laughing stock. But my testimony would not change. It's based on the annual amounts of water purportedly added, which in my view would not be added. It would simply, in above normal years, it would not be added. In other years, it would be reduced.
Now, I'd like to ask the next question, but I feel like maybe we set it up not to argue about the benefits of the VA flows, but is it your understanding that the VA flows, the additions being contemplated, are intended to provide a benefit to the environment, to fish and wildlife, to in-stream benefits?
From the perspective of the proponents, yes.
So based off that basic understanding, and we're not getting into, my intent is not to get into whether there's going to be benefits, but based off the understanding that the intended reason for the VA additions is to provide a benefit, is it your testimony that the only benefit that would come from VA additions would be a net increase in delta outflow?
No, I didn't say that. I simply said that the you have to look at the annual diversions and the annual additions under sites and the VAs respectively to determine what the net addition of change would be under both of them.
Would the timing of the VA additions matter to providing a benefit?
Yes, but the VAs are not set up to be a reoperation that just changes the timing of when water is released, other than on the McCollumney where East Bay Mud has at least been upfront about it. The VAs are intended to be additions, and I'm addressing the fact that what the VAs purport to add in some measure, sites will taketh away.
Is it your testimony that sites will take away those additions on a yearly basis, but not when those additions are being released?
On an average annual basis.
On an average annual net.
Right. And I have no idea. I don't think we know when exactly sites will divert, and even less do we know when the voluntary agreements will release water and how, if at all, those things would be coordinated, if they would.
That's all the questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Soderlund. I'll look to Ms. Alftenberg. Do you have questions for Mr. Schutz?
Hearing officer, this is Ray Solberg. Ms. Altenberg had to step out. I am substituting for her, and the reclamation has no questions.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And Ms. Mendel-Rice, do you have questions for Mr. Schutz?
I do not have questions for Mr. Schutz. Thank you.
All right, thank you. With that, I will look back to Mr. Mooney. Do you have redirect for Mr. Schutz?
No, I do not.
All right, we're moving right along. Mr. Schutz, thank you so much for your testimony. Thank you for being here today. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
And you are excused.
Thank you.
And with that, Mr. Mooney, remind me of the next witness. Do you know, is this your witness? Are you introducing this witness?
Yes, I will do the next witness as well. And it's Dr. Swanson.
Dr. Swanson, thank you. I had it written down and then couldn't find it. And there is Dr. Swanson. Wonderful. Thank you. If you would, Dr. Swanson, please raise your right hand and I will administer the oath. Dr. Swanson, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Mooney, you may introduce the witness.
Thank you. Could you please state your name for the record?
Christina Swanson.
Okay, and do you understand you're under oath?
I do.
Okay, and is Exhibit FOR 16 an accurate statement of your written testimony?
Yes, it is.
And did you prepare that testimony?
I did.
And do you have any corrections to your testimony?
Yes, I do. In reviewing my testimony and some of my references, I found one error. It's in my written testimony, page 13, paragraph 29, line 4. Line 4.
And could you state what that is?
The correction is to change the word year to decade. So at a rate of 5.4% per decade is the correct text. And the same error also exists in the summary of my written testimony on slide 7. The first bullet point, increasing greater than 5% per decade is the correct reading instead of per year. My apologies for that error.
And again, we can provide a written errata if the hearing officer would like for the record.
Please. Thank you very much.
And is exhibit FOR 15 an accurate statement of your qualifications?
Yes, it is.
And are exhibits FOR 120 to FOR 136 true and correct copies of exhibits to your testimony and relied upon in your testimony?
Yes.
And is FOR 31 an accurate summary of your testimony with the provision of the modification that you just provided?
Yes,
And then did you prepare that summary?
I did.
Okay, and would you please summarize your testimony?
I would be delighted. Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Kinsey, Ms. Mullen, and Ms. Cott, and the rest of the Administrative Hearing Office. I appreciate being here. My name is Christina Swanson. I am providing this testimony as a concerned California resident, an expert on climate change and California water and fisheries issues, and on behalf of the Common Interest Coalition led by the Friends of the River. I am an environmental scientist with decades of experience in California's water, fisheries, and climate change science and policy. This includes 14 years as a full or part-time postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Davis, 11 years with the Bay Institute, serving as fisheries scientist, senior scientist, and finally executive director, and 11 years with the Natural Resources Defense Council, serving as director of the organization's Science Center and senior scientist for science and policy. I currently serve as senior scientist for policy and private sector partnerships with Project Drawdown, an environmental NGO that works to develop and advance science-based solutions to mitigate climate change. Could I have the next slide? The purpose of my testimony is to examine and evaluate the relationship of the Sites Reservoir project with climate change. Climate change is an important issue for the Sites project for two reasons. First, the project plans to operate starting approximately 10 years from now and for many decades after that, a period during which the effects of climate change will substantially increase. Second, the project is described and advertised as a climate resilience and adaptation project to increase water supplies and improve water resource management activities that will be adversely affected by climate change. In my review of the project, I focused on the practical and operational aspects of the project in relation to climate change, including its water diversion, water storage, and water conveyance operations. I reviewed the project's 2023 amended water availability analysis, portions of the project's EIR/EIS, various other environmental documents and analyses for other water projects like the Delta Conveyance Project, relevant scientific literature, and relevant hydrological data. Next slide, please. I organized my assessment around three broad questions that encompass the basic principles defining California water rights and the doctrine of reasonable and beneficial use. Specifically, I asked the questions, is the water the project proposes to appropriate and divert available? Would that water be put to reasonable and beneficial use? And is the project and its proposal to appropriate and use the water in the public interest? Next slide, please. Based on my review and analysis, I concluded that under current conditions and relative to future climate change, the project is ill-conceived and operationally unsound. Because of this assessment, I further concluded that the answer to each of my guiding questions about water rights and reasonable and beneficial use of California's water was no. I have 4 reasons for my conclusion. Next slide, please. First, the availability of water for appropriation and diversion by the project has been, in my view, overestimated. Based on my review of the 2023 amended water availability analysis report, I believe that it is questionable whether the Sites project can divert the amounts of water it promises and upon which its purpose and operational viability, as I understand them, as a climate resilient water supply project and environmentally beneficial project depend. There are several reasons for my conclusions. First, as described, the site's project effectively cannot divert water during dry and critically dry years. Since the 1980s, the frequency of dry and critically dry water year types has already increased by 50%. However, most of the project's water availability modeling analyses underestimate the frequency of occurrence of dry and critically dry years because they're based on historical hydrological data sets that go back more than a century, or they use historical time sequences that end more than 20 years ago. Second, the downscaled climate models for the Sacramento Basin are ambiguous regarding whether annual precipitation levels will increase or decrease with climate change. Some models project increases in annual precipitation, others no change, and others project decreases. However, almost all of the project's modeling analyses for future conditions use regional climate models that assume future Sacramento River flows will be comparable to or higher than historical conditions. The single modeling analysis that assumed a more extreme warming and drier conditions found that in the future, more than half of all years would be dry or critically dry, water year types during which the project effectively can divert no water. This analysis also showed that Sacramento River flows would be substantially reduced in wet and above normal years, the year types during which the project would expect to divert water. Next, nearly all of the project's modeling analyses assume that no additional environmental regulatory flow requirements will be in place. The single analysis that included the required increases for delta outflow that are currently under consideration by the state board found that implementation of those environmental protections reduced water availability for diversion by the project by 57%, and that the seasonal time window for diversions was substantially reduced. Finally, the effects of climate change in the coming decades will worsen all of these factors, making the project's ability to divert water even less likely. Based on this, I argue that the answer to the question, is the water available, is probably not. Next, given the likely unavailability of sufficient volumes of water for the project's purposes and viability, allowing any water to be diverted by the project would not be a reasonable or beneficial use. Therefore, the answer to the second question is likely no. May I have the next slide, please? Second, storage of the diverted water in the site's reservoir will degrade its quality. Water quality degradation is an increasingly serious climate change-related problem in the lower watershed and delta. Increased water temperatures, combined with chronic nutrient pollution from a variety of sources, are already driving more frequent and severe harmful algal blooms and high levels of cyanotoxins. Harmful algal blooms and cyanotoxins harm water quality, adversely affecting human health, recreational use, aquatic food webs, fish and wildlife, vegetation, and wetland resources. Site's reservoir is a relatively shallow, low elevation reservoir that will be regularly exposed to high seasonal temperatures. Allowable diversion operations will only fill the reservoir every few years. Therefore, operationally, the reservoir will experience frequent, prolonged, low volume storage conditions. These conditions of shallow, stagnant, low volumes of polluted water exposed to seasonally high temperatures in the reservoir will effectively make site's reservoir an incubator for harmful algal blooms. On top of this, climate change will worsen these conditions and drive more frequent and extensive harmful algal blooms in the reservoir. Managing California's water in such a way that its quality is degraded through those operations is not a reasonable and beneficial use, and such a project is therefore not in the public interest. Next slide, please. Third, substantial fractions of the water supply provided by the project will be lost with little or no beneficial use to evaporation or carriage water requirements. Evaporative water loss from reservoirs has increased by more than 5% per decade, that's this one correction, during the past 3 decades. In addition to factors such as wind and temperature, the rate at which water evaporates from a reservoir is a function of its surface area to volume ratio. Sites Reservoir has a substantially higher surface to volume ratio than other similarly sized Central Valley reservoirs. Therefore, Sites Reservoir will lose disproportionately more of its stored water to evaporation than these other regional reservoirs. In addition, when water from the Sacramento Basin is conveyed through the Delta for export, a fraction of that water must be allowed to flow out of the Delta into the upper San Francisco Bay. The function of this carriage water is to repel saline water from the bay and to preserve sufficiently fresh water conditions in the Delta for the exported water to be usable for irrigation or drinking water supplies. Since 2008, the amount of carriage water required has varied between 20 and 35% of the transfer amount, depending on the hydrology and other operational parameters. More than half of the water released from Sites Reservoir will be conveyed to the Delta for exports to the Southern California, Bay Area, and San Joaquin Valley water users. Under current conditions, these water transfers would be subject to carriage water charges, effectively reducing the water supply value of this water by by at least 1/5, and under some conditions by as much as 1/3. Both of these problems, evaporation and carriage water losses, will be worsened by climate change through its effects on temperatures and sea level rise in the Delta. In the future, increasing proportions of water diverted from the Sacramento River into Sites Reservoir will be lost with little or no beneficial use, much of it evaporating to the atmosphere. This is not a reasonable and beneficial use, and thus the project is not in the public interest. Next slide, please. Finally, the project, which is advertised as a climate solution, will in fact be a new source of greenhouse gas emissions that are driving climate change. California is a global leader in greenhouse gas emissions reductions with ambitious climate goals. However, the state is currently not on track to meet its 2030 or other future emissions reductions goals. Achieving this goal will require 2 things. First, achieving more rapid emissions reductions from existing sources. And second, preventing the addition of new emissions sources. Implementation of the Sites project will add a significant new greenhouse gas emissions source to California's carbon budget. The project will generate substantial emissions during construction, and then throughout its operational life from the reservoir itself through decomposition of organic material and from the pumping operations to convey the water from the Sacramento River and to its storage partner users, most of whom are located hundreds of miles away and on the other side of a mountain range. Emissions from the reservoir, which includes substantial amounts of methane, a disproportionately potent greenhouse gas, cannot be directly mitigated. Pumping operations to convey Sites water being extremely heavy, uphill multiple times, are going to be energy intensive no matter what energy source is used. In addition to its problems with water availability and putting diverted water to reasonable and beneficial use, the project's impact as a new and long-term source of greenhouse gas emissions, most of which cannot be directly mitigated, is another reason to conclude that the project is not in the public interest. Next slide, please. The problems with the Sites Reservoir project encompass all aspects of its design, operations, and planned function as a water supply project and as a climate resilience project. For these reasons, the project is unlikely to be able to divert enough water to meet the project purposes, and any water it does divert will not be put to reasonable and beneficial use. Therefore, construction and operations of the project are not in the public interest, and the project's application to the board should be, to appropriate water from the Sacramento River should be rejected. That concludes my summary.
Thank you, Dr. Swanson. Ms. Chester, do you have questions for this witness?
I do, thank you.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Swanson, for being available. Can we please bring up FOR 15? Ms. Swanson, is this a copy of your most current resume?
Yes, it is.
Do you have any experience with climate change modeling?
Only by reviewing the results and discussing the implications and interpretation of those models with my scientific colleagues. I myself am not a climate modeler.
Do you have experience with hydraulic modeling?
Yes, only in the sense that I have interpreted and reviewed the results of hydraulic modeling and discussed it with my many colleagues over the many years that I worked on Sacramento, San Joaquin, and Bay Delta water issues.
Thank you. Can we please bring up FOR 16? Thank you. And PDF page 4, please. And please scroll down to paragraph 7. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. In this paragraph, Ms. Swanson, you cite to FOR 121 for the ways in which climate change will manifest in the Sacramento River Basin. Is that correct?
Yes. I don't have the, oh, I do. I beg your pardon. Yes, it is FOR 121, the citation number 2 there.
And can we please bring up FOR 121? Do you recognize this as FOR 121, California's 4th climate change assessment?
Yes.
And can we please go to PDF page 37? And can you please scroll to the last paragraph? Thank you. Do you see about halfway through on the left-hand side where a new sentence begins with new sources of surface water supply for agriculture?
Yes.
Now, if you keep reading this sentence, do you see that the authors propose that the site's reservoir as an offset project for snowpack losses?
Yes.
And can we please return to FOR 16, PDF page 4? And in paragraph 7 on page 4, do you list reduced snowpack as one of the ways that climate change may affect the Sacramento River Basin?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we please scroll to PDF page 5? Now, at the end of paragraph 8, you state that 30% of all years from 1906 to 1979 period were dry or critically dry, and 45% of all years from 1980 to 2023 are dry or critically dry. Is that correct?
Yes.
Are there the same number of years between 1906 to 1979 as there are between 1980 to 2023?
No.
There are obviously fewer years between 1980 to 2023, correct?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that the number of years from 1906 to 1907 is in fact almost double the number of years from 1980 to 1923?
Yes.
And when you're calculating a proportion, such as the number of dry years to a total number of years, isn't the total number of years mathematically significant to your results?
Yes, it's part of the calculation for how you calculate percent.
So is it reasonable to compare the relative number of dry water year types in two time periods that are not equal?
Yes,
And why is that?
because you're calculating them in the form of a percent, which is a proportion of the years within that period of years that those particular years occurred. This calculation takes into account the differences in the numbers of years between those two periods.
And if you had looked at a larger range of more recent years, would the percentage have changed?
The percentage changes because of when in the time frame the years are occurring. This calculation was based on the fact that after reviewing a bunch of climate variable datas, the effects of climate change on things like increased temperatures or precipitation variability or winter chill days started to become detectable in the historical record around the 1980s. My purpose in this calculation was to compare the frequency of dry and critically dry years in the period before which the effects of climate change were detectable based on other variables, compared to the period of years after which the effects of climate change were becoming apparent. My finding is that in the decades prior to the 1980s, the frequency with which we had dry or critically dry years, the sum of those two, was about 30%. Actually, it was exactly 30%. In the following 80 some odd year record from 1980 to 1923, the frequency of critically dry and dry years increased to the point where they comprised 45% of all of those years from the 1980 to the 1923 period.
Sorry, 1923 period?
I beg your pardon, did I say 1980 to 1923? I meant 2023.
How many wet years were there between 1906 and 1979?
I would have to go into the data to look that up. I do not have that number off the top of my head.
How many wet years were there between 1980 to 2023?
Same thing. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but it's certainly the data are available.
So you did not review data that showed the number of wet years changed during these two periods, correct?
I did not, because I was interested in how the frequency of dry and critically dry years, types of years during which the sites project can't functionally or effectively divert any water. I wanted to see how the frequency of those types of years changed. I'm sure I did the calculation and it's based on my notes, but I can't tell you what the answer is off the top of my head.
Wouldn't a comparison of the number of wet years be necessary to address the utility of Sites Reservoir?
It could be useful. I felt it was more useful in my analysis to ask the question, how frequently can the sites project not divert from the system? Presumably you could do the same from the other years. On the other hand, I will mention that basically the modeling done in the water availability analysis showed that sites could only divert water during some below normal years and above normal years and wet years. The increase in frequency of dry and critically dry years means that the combined frequency of those other 3 year types during which the sites project can divert is equivalently decreased. The actual distribution of below normal, above normal, and wet, I couldn't speak to without referring back to old notes or the original data set.
If the number of wet years remained relatively stable between these two time periods you analyzed, would that affect your conclusions?
I don't know.
What additional information would you need?
I think what I would do would be to review that aspect of the water availability report more, more closely.
Can we please go to PDF page 6, paragraph 13? You state in paragraph 13 that there would only be a few 100,000 acre-feet of water available in nearly all below normal years, correct?
Yes,
How many 100,000 acre-feet would be available in below normal years?
I'd have to go back and review the results that are reported in the water availability analysis. I think when, no, I'd have to go back and review that to see. I can't recreate that number off the top of my head.
Is the below normal year the only water year type in which the project would be able to divert?
No,
In your opinion, is it reasonable to evaluate the utility and viability of the project on only a segment of the years that the project will divert?
I don't believe that is what I have done. The project, based on its own water availability analysis, has shown, or that analysis shows, that effectively the project, because of the rules and constraints with regard to flows, cannot divert water in critically dry and dry years. In below normal years, they were able to divert some water, certainly not enough to fill a 1.5 million acre feet reservoir in some below normal years, but if I recall correctly, in some other below normal years, they couldn't. It probably had to do with the antecedent years.
So your conclusion in this paragraph, beginning in line 21, is not based solely on your review of below normal water years?
This statement essentially summarizes the results that are presented in the water availability report. Those results show that in below normal years, only relatively lower amounts of water, a few thousand, 100,000 acre feet, can be diverted into Sites Reservoir. It isn't a conclusion on my part, it's a reporting of the results that are presented in the water availability analysis.
Can we please scroll to paragraph 14? Thank you. You state that sites' water availability analyses assume conditions will be the same as those that occurred during the past 2 to 10 decades. Is that correct?
Yes.
What water availability analyses are you referring to?
I'm referring to the 2023 amended water availability analysis.
In paragraph 15, if we can scroll down, please. Thank you. You state that there is underrepresentation of dry and critical years in the analytical data sets, correct?
I'm stating that the years in which the historical hydrological conditions in the years that were analyzed using the various sources of those historical hydrological data sets for the 3 historical analyses that they did in those years, for those sequences of years, that the frequency of dry and critically dry years was lower than the frequency of those types of years is now under current conditions and likely future conditions.
You refer in line 16 to that 82-year period, and that's the calcium 2 analysis of flows from 1922 to 2003, correct?
Yes,
And you conclude that 37% of years during that period were dry or critically dry, correct?
yes, that's according to the CDEC water year type data set.
And you say that 45% of water years from 2004 to 2023 have been dry or critically dry, correct?
Yes. Also from the same CDEC water year type data set.
Is it correct that there are 19 years between 2004 and 2023?
I'm sorry, you cut out at the end. Did you ask how many years were between 2004 and 2023? And was that 19 years?
Yes, that's my question.
That is correct. That is a 19-year period.
Is it reasonable to use the relative proportion of dry and critical years in that 19-year period to conclude that the calcium modeling period is underrepresented?
I think it's reasonable to make that comparison, and the results indicate that the frequency of dry and critically dry years between those two sequences of time are different. I will say I did not do a statistical comparison to determine whether that difference was statistically significant.
And you also state that the time period for the face value analysis is 1922 to 2014, correct?
Yes,
And that's a period of 102 years, correct?
yeah, no,
I believe you say in your testimony the last century, is that correct?
yes. It's approximately a century long. And it's about a century ago.
And is it reasonable to use the relative proportion of dry and critical years in the 19-year period between 2004 and 2023 to conclude that the face value analysis is underrepresented?
Yes.
Why?
I'm sorry, you cut out again. I'm not certain whether you had a question.
I did. I asked why.
Why? What I did was I compared the frequency of critically dry and dry years between these two periods. The results of that analysis showed that the frequency of dry and critically dry years was more frequent during these later periods since 1980, or using also the comparison of 2004 to 2023, compared to the periods of hydrologic record that were being used for these various historical analyses. So the numbers are different, although, as I said, I did not do a statistical comparison, but based on my analysis, there were fewer or less frequent dry and critically dry years during the older time periods compared to the more recent time period.
Is it correct that you would need to do a statistical analysis to understand the relative frequency between a 19-year period and a period lasting a century?
That would add more rigor to the analysis, yes.
Is there a reason you did not include the historical water availability analysis in your conclusions in this paragraph?
I'm sorry, I'm not certain I understand your question about the historical water availability analysis.
Did you include it in your analysis in paragraph 15?
According to my read and review of the water availability analysis, they conducted 3 different analyses that they considered to be historical analyses. One was the calcium 2, the other was the face value, and I've forgotten what the other one was, but it's listed here. All 3 of these were historical analyses.
Can we please scroll to paragraph 18? You state that a single point result meant to represent and describe a range of results is risky and minimally informative. Is that correct?
Yes,
Are you familiar with the selection process for global climate model projections?
I reviewed the descriptions of how the models were selected for these particular climate models. But my knowledge basically is limited to what I was able to read with that. I certainly have not, as I mentioned, I'm not a climate modeler myself, but I did review the methods that were used to describe how the 2035 central tendency and the 2070 central tendency methods were developed.
Are you aware that the climate change modeling was developed by the California Department of Water Resources Climate Change Technical Advisory Group?
That was my understanding.
Thank you. Can we please scroll to paragraph 20? You state in this paragraph that if future conditions are drier and warmer than expected, more than half of all years will be dry or critically dry. Is that correct?
Yes,
If the future is expected to be hotter and drier, should the state begin planning now for future water supply needs?
yes, that would make sense to me.
Can we please scroll to paragraph 24? Footnote 20. Thank you. Or I think it may be on the next page. Thank you. And in this footnote, you state that you rely on testimony from your colleagues. Is that correct?
Yes.
Whose testimony do you rely on?
In this one, with regard to impacts on hydrological conditions, water supply, water quality, and fish and wildlife, primarily I'm relying on the testimony of Dr. Rosenfield. And also, I believe we have someone else testifying on the effects on water quality. I'm not privy. I made this footnote here because I was aware that colleagues from our Common Interest Coalition were covering these other topics in relation to Sites Reservoir, and I was not going to cover them.
Thank you. Can we please scroll back up to paragraph 24? Thank you. In this paragraph, you state that Sites Reservoir will not serve as a climate adaptation project. Is that correct?
That is my view, yes.
Is it correct that in simplistic terms, a climate adaptation project is intended to reduce the physical risks of climate change?
No. Climate adaptation project, in my interpretation, is a project that is intended to respond and compensate for the adverse impacts of climate change.
What is a climate resilience project?
Lots of people use climate adaptation and climate resilience interchangeably. And I think that in the context of how the Sites project has been described, as well as the terminology used in some of the state's reports, they are using them interchangeably. Technically, those two terms are different, speaking as a scientist. But I will say, in general, my interpretation of a climate adaptation project or a climate resilience project is a project that is meant to compensate for and maybe potentially repair the adverse impacts that climate change may be imposing on some function, in this case, water supply or water quality conditions in the rivers.
Based on your definition, is increasing water storage for future dry years a type of adaptation or resilience project?
Yes.
And water storage projects aren't the only type of adaptation or resilience projects, correct?
That is correct.
Could other types of adaptation or resilience projects result in the production of greenhouse gases?
Yes.
Can we please scroll back up to PDF page 6? Paragraph 11. Thank you. You say that we're not on track in this paragraph to reduce emissions to global net zero greenhouse gas emissions, so climate change impacts will worsen. Is that right?
Yes.
Is it in the public interest to forego all drought adaptation or resilience projects that may generate greenhouse gases?
I think the public interest is best served by pursuing those projects which provide the greatest benefit with the least impact.
And can we please scroll down again to paragraph 26? Thank you. Ms. Swanson, in this paragraph, you state that there are more frequent and severe harmful algal blooms, or HABs, and high levels of cyanotoxins in the lower reaches of the watershed and delta. Is that correct?
Yes.
You don't cite a source. What data did you use to reach that conclusion?
Given that I didn't cite this one, which I probably should have cited a source too. However, having worked in this system for 20 and 30 years, I observed the increased frequency of harmful algal blooms over time.
And what do you mean by observed?
I was involved with various organizations that were working to improve environmental conditions in the system, and it became apparent that we were observing and detecting in the system harmful algal blooms that were occurring with more frequency, more often as time went on.
And that detection was specifically in the lower reaches of the watershed and the delta?
That seems to be where they are most common, yes.
Can we please go to PDF page 12? Paragraph 28. In this paragraph, you discuss the surface area to volume ratio of the site's reservoir, correct?
Yes.
In line 16, where does the 66.66 square kilometers for the site surface area come from?
I Googled it.
Did you intentionally choose not to use the surface area reported in the site's EIR and EIS?
I didn't know that there was a measurement for that there. So no, it was not intentional.
You then compare the site's surface area to volume ratio to that of Oroville and San Luis reservoirs. Is that correct?
Yes.
What is the volume of the Oroville reservoir?
The Oroville Reservoir is on the Feather River.
And you have the volume listed there as 3,538,000 acre feet, correct?
Yes, I Googled that too.
And you have the volume of the San Luis Reservoir listed as 2,041,000 acre feet, is that correct?
Yes.
And do you know the proposed volume of the site's reservoir?
It's my understanding that it's 1.5 million acre feet.
If you're comparing two reservoirs with similar surface areas, wouldn't the reservoir with the smaller volume have a higher surface area to volume ratio?
Yes.
Why did you choose to compare the surface area to volume ratio of two projects with larger volumes than the site's reservoir?
I was looking to find reservoirs that were in the region. And one of those reservoirs, Oroville Reservoir, has a relatively similar surface area to sites. The other reservoir, San Luis Reservoir, has a relatively similar volume to sites. So the reason I chose these two reservoirs is A, they're in roughly the same region, meaning the Central Valley, and B, they're comparably sized with regard to either surface area or volume compared to the site's reservoir.
Did you make the surface area to volume calculations for any other reservoirs?
No,
Did you consider other reservoirs for the purposes of your comparison in paragraph 28?
I did not.
On PDF page 13 in paragraph 29, we can scroll. Thank you. At line 4, you made a correction to your testimony, correct?
Yes,
And with your correction, the evaporative rate is actually increased by only 1/10 the rate you originally stated in your testimony, correct?
that is correct. Yes, I did incorrectly use per year when I meant per decade.
Does that change your conclusion in paragraph 29 that climate change will worsen the problem of evaporative water loss?
No, it does not,
Why not?
because an increase of 5% evaporative water loss per decade is still a very substantial increase in evaporative rates.
And what's the basis for that conclusion?
My conclusion that it's substantial, or the conclusion that this is the rate and that it's increasing over time?
Thank you, that it's 5.4% per decade is substantial.
That is my interpretation of what these numbers mean, which is one of the things that I do as a scientist.
And did you compare that evaporative rate to any other information or data?
Any other, you broke up again, I'm sorry.
Vague and ambiguous in terms of what other information. I mean, just
That's fair. I'll move on to paragraph 36, please, on PDF page 16. In this paragraph, you discuss methane emissions, is that correct?
Yes,
Did you review the EIR, EIS analysis accounting for the release of methane?
are you referring to the EIR AIS for the site's reservoir?
Yes, correct.
No, I did not review that.
Are you familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC?
Yes,
So you're not aware whether the site's final EIR or EIS complied with the IPCC standards?
I'm sorry, I'm not entirely certain what you're referring to with regard to IPC standards.
Okay. Can we please scroll to paragraph 38? At line 16, you discuss needs for pumping water to Southern California water users, correct?
Yes,
And you state that fossil fuels currently contribute to about 40% of electrical production, correct?
that's my understanding of California's electricity portfolio, yes.
What is that 40% based on? What's your source?
Did I not cite anything? I probably looked that up on the web, but I see I did not cite a specific source.
If you were going to confirm your source for that statistic, where would you look?
Probably I'd go to some of the California documents on our climate change mitigation activities and the progress thereof.
Isn't it correct that the state has a set of renewable portfolio goals?
Yes,
Are you aware that the state set a goal of reaching 100% renewable energy by 2045?
yes,
If Sites Reservoir is purchasing electricity, isn't it reasonable to assume it would be purchasing an increasing amount of electricity from renewable sources over time?
yes,
You also state in paragraph 38 that the project will generate substantial new greenhouse gas emissions. Is that correct?
yes.
What do you mean by substantial?
I mean, that's a good question. The project is going to be generating new greenhouse gas emissions on the basis of its construction, which are those greenhouse gas emissions are actually documented in the EIR. It's going to be generating new emissions from the reservoir itself through decomposition of the organic material. Reservoir emissions currently globally, based on decomposition of organic material and particularly the methane problems, are estimated to be approximately 1.3% of global emissions. That's not included in this testimony. I'm trying to expand on your on my answer. And then the energy needs for moving this water all around. I think it is my judgment that those amounts of emissions will be easily detectable in terms of changes in the overall emissions levels of the state. Hence my use of substantial, which is probably a less than precise term.
And have you calculated the amount of emissions that may be generated by Sites Reservoir?
No, I have not.
And so what is the basis for your conclusion that they would be measurable?
One of the things that the state does, and let me back up. These emissions are measurable in that they can also be calculated based on the activities that generate the emissions. That's usually the way that emissions are calculated, is based on predictions of how much any particular activity, the amount of fossil fuel burned, the amount of organic material in a reservoir. Emissions are predicted based on that. They are not necessarily measured in situ as greenhouse gas emissions essentially arising from the particular site. They're usually measured, and I use that in quotes, based on calculations.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chester. I will look to Mr. Soderlund. Do you have questions for Dr. Swanson?
I do not, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Auftenberg? Do you have questions for Dr. Or I'm sorry, we had and I wrote down your name. You stepped in for Ms. Auftenberg.
No questions.
Mr. Solberg, did I get that right?
Yeah.
Do you
No
have
questions from reclamation?
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And then Ms. Mandel Rice, do you have questions for Dr. Swanson? Late in the day, we might be losing folks here. All right, well, I'll take that as a no, and I will turn to you, Mr. Mooney. Do you have redirect for Dr. Swanson?
No.
All right, great. Well, thank you. I appreciate your testimony today, Dr. Swanson. You are excused. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
With that, I know we moved through this quickly, which is good, efficiently. I don't think we'd projected to have another witness, so I wanted to check in maybe with you, Mr. Mooney, or with the others in terms of whether you're prepared with another witness at this time, or whether what is the status to your knowledge?
We do not have another witness. We are not prepared with another witness today because we really thought we'd have,
Right.
Missed it by 45 minutes.
Right. I mean, frankly, I did too. Maybe we can use this time to just project where we are with the other witnesses. And I don't know if that's a question for you or Ms. Dorman, who I know sent in this helpful chart, we're looking, if you could just remind me where we are in the lineup and whether there are other concerns in terms of witness availability as we look forward to October 8th, 9th, and 10th.
Yeah, go ahead, Jan, if you want to go,
I
or I
am
can.
just pulling that information up.
No
So
problem.
based on the order that we submitted, we have ready to go the next hearing day, Tuesday, October 8th, Scott Artis, George Bradshaw, and Sean Smallwood. So George Bradshaw has, he's coming in from his fishing boat on the ocean specially for this one day, so he can only testify October 8th. If people think we could do 4 witnesses, after this, I could inquire of some of our later witnesses if one of them might be able to move up to next Tuesday.
Yes, it does seem like, I mean, we're moving fairly quickly. So that would be helpful. If you could look into that, and then, and if you would, please let us know
Yes,
as soon as possible, because that will be relevant to the other parties and to me.
yes.
That would be
Well,
quite helpful.
Go
Go ahead.
mean, I was going to say, what would be helpful also, though, if we, and we've appreciated it in the past, if we get an estimate on amount of cross with these respective witnesses, that would give us a better indication as well.
Yes, so let's go ahead, and I will turn to, I'll start with you, Ms. Chester, since you seem to be asking most of the questions today. Do you have an estimate with respect to the 3 witnesses we identified, Mr. Artis, Mr. Bradshaw, and Mr. Smallwood?
I will need to defer to Mr. Hitchings.
That's fair. Thank you. Mr. Hitchings.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. Yeah, it's a little hard to tell, but I think it's approximately an hour for each of those. Just depends on how the answers go. And I also wanted to clarify, so that would be for, yes, Mr. Artis, Mr. Bradshaw, and Dr. Smallwood. And then I know the protestants had listed George Bradshaw or Lisa Damrosch. I'm assuming that Mr. Bradshaw is covering that written testimony that was submitted, and there would not be testimony by Ms. Damrosch. Is that correct?
My understanding was that if Mr. Bradshaw was lost at sea, that Ms. Damrosch would cover the written testimony that was submitted.
Well, good. I'm glad that Mr. Bradshaw will then be testifying. There's a lot of benefits, obviously.
So I am just going to, in the spirit of conservation of everybody's time, I am also going, well, I'm going to inquire of the October 10th witnesses if the 2 of them can move up to an earlier day, either the 8th or the 9th. And I will let everyone know the results of that.
Great.
This is Eric Busher. I was just going to add one note there. I mean, we have some scheduling restrictions after Dr. Michael, right after the witness is listed through the 10th. Given how efficiently this has gone, and thank you, Ms. Chester, I appreciate that. I would expect that we will get through, Dr. Michael on the 9th or maybe the beginning of the 10th at the latest. And we won't have the ability to move up, right, Dr. Connor or Eli Asarian or Dr. Rosenfield into that earlier window next week. So we may need, I don't know how the hearing officer wants to handle that. I just wanted to flag that I expect we'll get through everybody who can be here by the 10th, on the 9th, it looks like, if they're available.
Right, and I thank you for that, Mr. Busher, because that is where I was going, and was thinking about whether I guess I'll look to, I believe the what we're calling the Delta users, Mr. Reese or Ms. Meserve, it looks like we might target the 10th for the start of your cases in chief. Does that work for you in terms of witness availability?
As far as witness availability, it does. Miss Meserve is out that week, and we were hoping that we would end up not starting until the next round of hearing days, but that's our only issue with that.
Well, and the other question, and I don't believe I'm looking to see, we also have Mr. King and Mr. Ornbound, so that was another possibility in terms of moving up presentations of cases in chief. I know, Mr. King, I'd written down you're not available the 8th and the 21st, so the 10th might be a good day for you. I see, are you on the line, Mr. King? I see your iPhone is connected, but. And what I can do is send this out in writing as well as an inquiry. I think would it be helpful to hear from you, Ms. Norman, in terms of your witness availability. Mr. King, hi, Mr. King.
Yes, I may be about which day we're talking about, the 10th, is that right?
10th, October 10th, yeah.
Yeah, I can't speak for Mr. Ornbaum, but
fair.
I can ask him, what do you think both of us would be on the 10th? And then also, if you could give me some guidance, how much time I'm going to have. I understand I have 10 minutes for opening statement and 10 minutes for my case in chief. And I'm trying to figure out how that actually works. And I guess the question is how much cross and how much challenge to my my testimony or my written testimony. So, I don't know how much guidance you can give me on that, but that's also part of the calculus.
Yes, it is. So let's work through this. What I'd like to do is go ahead and I can give you for purposes of scheduling, let's give you a commitment that I can have you present on the 10th, given that we do need to work around some of the other witnesses for the coordinating NGO parties. So let's go ahead with you, Mr. King, on the 10th. It is 10 minutes for opening statements. You may make an opening statement and we'd reserve 10 minutes for a summary of your direct testimony. And then I'm not sure if any of the parties here at this time, we hadn't gotten this far. I don't think we have an estimate of for your cross, but I can look to the parties as we get closer. So on the 8th, if you would remind me, I can ask everyone to be prepared with estimates for cross.
Yeah, on the 8th, I may be able to attend the morning, but not the afternoon.
Okay.
I have conflict the afternoon.
I can, but maybe I'll turn to the authority. Ms. Chester or Mr. Hitchings, do you happen to have an estimate for cross-examination of Mr. King, or do you need time to look at this?
At this time, the estimate is about a half an hour or less for both Mr. King and Mr. Ornbaum.
Okay, there we go. There we have it. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, and then also, I'll reach out to Mr. Ornbaum. And do you think it's going to be in the morning or the afternoon?
Well, that is harder to predict. Let's see. Let me look. I'm sorry. I'm clicking around and looking up at our schedule here. Let me get back to you on that. I think it will depend on how far we get on. We'll know more when how far we get on the 8th.
Right. I can be more flexible. Mr. Ornbaum's in the middle of a variety of harvests.
Yes, I understand that. And I'm willing to be flexible with the schedule. So if he is available on the 10th, whether in the morning or the afternoon, the thing is sometimes these things flow over. So it's a little bit difficult to make it, as we know, things sometimes take longer than anticipated. But if he's available either in the morning or the afternoon, and the AHO can send out an email inquiry to his contact information as well, so that we are all on the service list and we're all aware of what the expectation is. But if we can fit you in, Mr. King and Mr. Ornbound, on the 10th, I think we should plan to do that. We'll keep moving.
Okay, and then my last question is regarding my opening statement. I understand I can submit one in writing also, and then read from that or paraphrase from that. What is the correct form?
Normally, do not need to submit it in writing, and I actually think would be, in this case, the others would be best to just summarize it orally. If you're planning to give an oral presentation, I would suggest that you go with that. You will have an opportunity in closing briefs at the end of this process to put your arguments in writing in a more lengthy form. So I would ask that you provide an oral summary.
Okay, so just anticipate 10 minutes of oral opening statement and
Right.
then an oral summary. And does it have to be a summary, or can I focus on a specific part of my written testimony?
So you can focus on a specific part. The limitation is that your testimony, your oral testimony, must be limited to what you've already submitted in writing.
Correct, I understand that.
Beyond. And then just keep in mind, in terms of an opening statement versus your oral testimony, the opening statement is not admitted as evidence in the record.
Correct. Okay. And I can be more policy focused on that if I have given 10 minutes of time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you for that explanation. And I'll try to reach out Mr. Ornbaum, but I will make myself available, at the court's convenience, at your convenience on the 10th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there other comments to help how we do this and try to fit as much in as we can? Or questions? What else do we, Mr. Busher? No, okay.
This is Mr. Reese. I have just a follow-up comment. It sounds like you're trying to help accommodate us, the Delta Water users, to start on the 21st. But it sounds like that's what I'm hearing. But
that is my attempt. I mean, if we that's what I would like to do. I think we're going to have plenty to do, but if we're able to schedule Mr. King and Mr. Ornbound, I think we'll have plenty to do on the 8th, 9th, and 10th. It is a little awkward here because then we're going to have we'll have the 21st. There'll be some overlap here. If maybe let me ask this question of the coordinating NGO parties. Mr. Khan and Mr. Asarian, are they only available on the 21st, or could we move them to the 4th? And the reason to do that would be to avoid this having different testimony in the middle of the Delta users case in chief. Although maybe that's not a problem. If it doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother me. But that was my.
We can live with it if need be.
Okay.
I can inquire if they are available on November 4th. They're backpacking now. And they're not back until the 21st.
Okay.
So I will determine if they could go on the 4th.
As another possibility, that would be helpful. And then we'll have that flexibility. I appreciate that.
Okay, just so I understand, I'm going to find out if the witnesses currently estimated for October 10th, Mark Easter and Jeff Michael, if they can move up to the 8th and the 9th.
Yes.
And I am going to find out if Jacob Kahn and Eli Asarian that are currently estimated for October 21st, if they can move to November 4th. And I will inform everyone of those results.
Would be whether they would also be available on the 4th.
Okay, so both.
Yes, I would appreciate that.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. And Mr. Reese, yes, my attempt here, and I think we have I think I'm willing to, I'm now going to say I'm going to make a commitment that we won't hear the case in chief from the Delta users until the 21st. Right, that's our first date after the 10th. We have a week.
We appreciate that. Thank you.
Great. Are there other, Mr. Hitchings, please?
Yes, thank you. And then I just had a question, maybe Mr. Ruiz can answer it. As I recall, Dr. Herbold, one of their witnesses, had some availability issues, but maybe he's available during that week of the 21st, but just wanted to confirm if there are availability issues for him.
Not any longer. That was earlier in the proceedings.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schutz.
Yes, it came up today in cross-examination that the numeration of my last paragraphs was duplicative. And and I'm sorry about that.
Oh, this is something I would do. I'm glad.
Yeah, it's something I got chastised for in elementary school.
Yep.
And some things don't change. Given the circumstance that the cross-examination referred to the existing numbers and Ms. Chester pointed out that it was the second number such and such. Would it be appropriate for me to submit my errata, because I want to change that in red line strikeout form so that it was readily evident to anyone what the who was looking at the transcript, where to find what the transcript was referring to?
I think that would be a good idea unless anyone has an concern with that, but that makes sense to me that then we would know both ways. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Are there other procedural issues that we can tackle today? Otherwise, I will give us all 29 minutes back of our day. All right, I believe we will reconvene on the 8th and at 9 o'clock as usual. And once again, I want to thank everyone for their professionalism and our efficiency today. And we are adjourned. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Hitchings, you mentioned a witness for Mr. Ruiz. I didn't get that name. It was the last one you mentioned.
Yeah, Angela, it's Bruce Herbold, Herbold.
BOLD. Herbold.
Yeah, Herbold.